Well, it's Professor Wham. This is my first installment of these articles or presentations that I produced, some of these many years ago, that I'm providing for your entertainment and educational use. This very first one I decided to do is the one that I talked about, the presentation that I did at the Library of Congress. I had a fellowship in the Library of Congress, or at the Library of Congress, that spanned from late 2003 to 2004. And so it's been a little over 20 years ago that I did this presentation. And this presentation was the culmination of the work that I had done there. So part of what I had to do was provide a background to what I had gotten the fellowship in. So that's kind of how the presentation begins. It says, my research at the library has focused on the contextual, cultural, and content connections between, in this case, it was 4 sectarian texts. And that's how I refer to them, texts that make the claim to be both revelatory and of a new dispensation, intended to replace, complete, or substantively augment the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, as understood and received by the Protestant tradition in the United States. The books that I looked at there, although I've looked at some subsequently, but the books that I looked at there were the Book of Mormon, OAHSPE, the Urantia book, and the Book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch. My task here at the library has been simple: how theories of race and American exceptionalism, which I define here as simply the cultural narrative of America as the Redeemer nation in history, are articulated in these texts. America, as a collection of cultures, has a particularly large and rich collection of such texts and communities. And as Lawrence Moore, who I will talk about in a minute, has so cogently expressed, a seemingly endless predilection for producing a revelation and faith community for each and every, quote, purpose and concern under heaven. Accordingly, each of these texts regards itself as a synthesis of previous religious thought and a new revelation, while in all instances concomitantly disavowing its own content of being of infallible origin. This, of course, implies that revelation and interpretation can and must continue. So that's how my presentation began. Now, let me pause and go into sort of providing more of a current context for this. I became interested in OAHSPE initially because of its connection to Ray Palmer, the famous pulp magazine entrepreneur of Amazing Stories and Fate magazine fame, who promoted the Shaver mystery and underwrote Kenneth Arnold, you know, the dude who saw the 9 UFOs over Mount Rainier, and that sighting spawned the journalistic mistake that coined the term flying saucer. So that Ray Palmer. And of course, Ray Palmer sent Kenneth Arnold on a trip to investigate what is now known as the Maury Island UFO hoax, which, even though we now consider it to be a hoax, it was an interesting hoax and certainly had its own mysteries attached to it. Now, Ray Palmer was very interested in OAHSPE, not the least because of its curious origins and its even more curious content as well, and the fact that it had spawned a community which, despite its external failings, continues to exist. Had at that time, and in fact continues to exist today. He was so interested, in fact, that he financed a reprint of one of the third or fourth editions, and I say third or fourth because there's some debate as to which it is, basically, which is often referred to as the green volume, which, if you can look in the little window here, I have my copy of the green volume, and it is referred to this way because it is green. It includes photographic plates of various of John Newbrow's, that's the prophet in question, his paintings, as well as some of the Shalom county, why do I call it county? Shalom colony, which he founded in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So clearly this edition was not a first edition, but he was basically reprinting an earlier edition that had been printed in the 1890s. Now, as I delved into the history of OAHSPE, I too became fascinated with it, partly because of its contents, again, which are interesting, and that I'll get into, and partly because it came to represent to me an example of something that seems to be somewhat unique in American religious culture, namely a tradition of text-based prophetic utterance that is intended to both express and solve deeply entrenched American social and political tensions, while at the same time asserting, as I indicate in the beginning of my presentation, that it is augmenting, reinterpreting, or supplanting the Bible, which of course is often touted as being at the core of American civilization. So all kinds of ideas are touched upon in this, the notion of a new nation needing a new scripture or an additional scripture, or an idealistic country requiring a repaired text to guide it, whatever. I mean, all these things come up. Eventually, this interest in OAHSPE led me to consider other texts, many of which I mention in the presentation just now, not just channeled materials in general, but only those that are contained within single volumes and are often presented as extra-biblical or sacred texts in themselves. And if you actually open up OAHSPE, you can see that. I don't know if you can see this, but it's printed in double column, very much like a Bible would be. And in fact, there's been a more recent reprint. I think it was in 2017. You can get on Amazon and see it. And it presents itself like a Bible. You know, it's got the gilded letters and the nice print, and, you know, it's presenting itself as a Bible in a sense. And in fact, I believe that it refers to itself in the very beginning as the Cosmon Bible, because John Newbrow restarted the calendar, and so he was counting things in what he called Cosmon years. Anyway, these extra biblical texts are the Book of Mormon, the Urantia Book, the Book of Knowledge, A Course in Miracles, and Seven Circle Quran. So I've read and examined all of these over the course of my life. I've actually read them, I've read them. I discovered that each of these texts not only had a unique provenance, but they shared certain characteristics. The first characteristic was they each have a highly contested documentary history, or there are several versions. Different community members may claim that they have access to more authentic versions, leading to schism, in some cases outright copyright lawsuits. OAHSPE is one of these. The only text where that doesn't apply that I'm familiar with is the Book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch, and that's because J.J. Hurtak, the prophet of that text, has kept a very close and tight hand on copyright. Going after, he even goes after people for their interpretations of his text, not just for copying it, but for their interpretations of it. It's like he tries to control even how you interpret it, which, of course, is way beyond the limits of copyright. But anyway, two, subsequent texts often evidence knowledge of previous such texts and plainly address them. And what that means is that, you know, you have the Book of Mormon as kind of like the first example, but then you have OAHSPE, and then you have several others, like the Seven Circle Quran, and then the Urantia book, and then the Book of Knowledge, the Course in Miracles. So most of these texts actually are familiar with previous texts, and they reference them in some way. So like the OAHSPE references the Book of Mormon. Urantia references OAHSPE and the Book of Mormon. The Seven Cycle Quran references the Book of Mormon, references OAHSPE. So in other words, people who produce these texts know of the previous texts, and they reference them either by direct attribution, you know, they actually name them, or they will use language that were usage or terms that were generated within those previous texts, and they will fold them into their text and maybe redefining them or using them in a slightly different way. But in other words, what we're talking about here is the beginnings of a tradition. When people do that, that's the beginnings of a tradition. So 3, because they are American texts, there is one exception to this, the central concerns of the texts tend to focus on race, class, occasionally gender. The one that focuses a lot on gender is A Course in Miracles. And that's mostly due to some of the controversies surrounding the use of gender in the text. And also reinterpretations of religious and political history and the tangles between religion and science. So all of them contain elements of that. 4, each of these texts has formed the basis of a spiritual community, sometimes more than one, but are often influential far outside of those communities. And 5, although each text is eccentric and unique, some would say odd, each also anticipates and often has prescient insights, and these insights can be true, into topics that will occupy large sectors of humanity in coming years, particularly Americans. These proclamations are often viewed as evidence of prophecy by subsequent followers and become part of the basis for belief. So I'll talk about that in OAHSPE, but this is the case actually in all of them. What that indicates to me is that in the effort to try to solve some of the tensions that each of these texts is trying to deal with, they do have insights into sometimes scientific information, sometimes psychological information. They do have insights and possible solutions that are interesting. In fact, OAHSPE evinces 2, and was it 2? Maybe it's 3. No, it's 2. 2.5, at least 2, maybe 3. My brain is not working quite well right now, but at least 2 scientific theories that are now considered to be mostly fact or possible fact that were not even thought about or known at the time when he was writing, and yet are commonly accepted today. And we'll talk about those when we get to them. Now, not a great deal of scholarly work has been done on OAHSPE. At least at the time when I did this presentation, there were just 2 or 3 dissertations that had been written about it and a scattering of academic papers. At the time when I wrote this presentation for the Library of Congress, there was only one largely recognized dissertation, which basically presented the history of Shalom Colony, and which I used as a source. The most recent, to my knowledge, scholar of Dr. John Newbrow is Dr. Susan B. Martinez, who wrote her dissertation, The Hidden Prophet, which, yes, I do actually happen to have it, The Hidden Prophet, about the origins of OAHSPE, and it's a biography, basically, of Dr. John Ballou Newbrow. And Jeffrey Pritchett and I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Martinez a few years ago on the Church of Mavis radio podcast. And I think it was a few years ago. I think it was towards the beginning of the pandemic. I don't really remember exactly when it was. But she's a true believer in OAHSPE. So I finally had a faithist to talk to, which was, of course, a treat to me. Now, the other thing that all of these texts kind of claim, and it's funny, they both claim it and don't claim it at the same time, is that they don't claim that they're infallible in the way that the Bible is claimed to be infallible by at least some believers. And I think that that's really a reaction to that claim of infallibility. You know, that's sort of an American reaction to that. It's like, you know, and not even believers anymore, for the most part, will say that these texts are infallible, you know, in the same way that, say, certain fundamentalists will say that the Word of God or the Bible is infallible. So anyway, let's get to the rest of the presentation. Since this was a scholarly presentation, of course, I had to frame it using certain academic sources. So these are the two academic sources that I used that sort of undergirded or provided a framework, if you will, for this presentation. One is by Bruce Dane. It is called A Hideous Monster of the Mind, American Race Theory in the Early Republic. And the other is called Selling God by R. Lawrence Moore, American Religion in the Marketplace of Culture. Both of these are excellent books. I believe they're both still available or in print. I know Bruce Dane's book is. Bruce Dane's book is actually a collaboration between him and a man named, I believe, John Haller, I believe is his name, who's a sociologist. And this book is based on primary sources. It looks at and this is what I'll be talking about in the presentation. It looks at both the monogenetic and polygenetic theories of human origins, and the reinterpretations of American history that came out of these stories of origins. Returning to the presentation, discussions of race theory and articulations of America's unique destiny consistently recur in most, if not all, of the American revelatory texts that I've examined, and this is particularly true of OAHSPE. Indeed, these two themes, while not necessarily foregrounded in each text, provide the background assumptions from which the main narratives of the text emerge. Race theories are always connected to the question of human origins, the past, and history, and American exceptionalism is always connected to the future, to promise, and to issues of redemption. Often these two background narratives act as bookends, as it were, in which the conflicts engendered by their being different types of human beings are redeemed by the incarnation of a unique nation with a singular set of principles based on liberty and equality, even if this requires identifying and subduing the evil, degenerate races by name. Indeed, the perpetuation of this dynamic is so striking and pervasive that it probably more than anything else is what renders these revelatory productions distinctly American. All right, and again, I will make some exception there for A Course in Miracles, and it does that with gender in many ways. And that's a separate discussion. It is notable in this regard to remember that even for Americans whose holy book remained the Bible, it has frequently been considered necessary by specific faith communities to read into the text, to read into the Bible references to racial origin, differentiation or unity, and American Redeemer destiny, of which a few examples will be given below, and it's not like such isn't present in our current life circumstances. I wrote that 20 years ago, so I'll just leave that with you. Such interpretations of history render history, quote unquote, fulfilled, and by implication of no further importance except perhaps as an ideological deployment, as the past and future have been accounted for, and one is only waiting for the final moment of a redemption already considered manifest, namely the nation. So my presentation today, however, will only focus on one of these texts, OAHSPE, and that is, I believe, how you pronounce it. My understanding is that OAHSPE is said to come from indigenous languages, meaning sky, earth, and sea, or spirit, sky, earth, and spirit, or something like that. And in fact, one of the Facebook groups that you can connect to now basically uses that translation of OAHSPE. There isn't a word like that, by the way. This was a word that was given, through the Spirit to him. But in any case, I believe that's how you pronounce it. So I will tell you the story of OAHSPE and the man who produced it, John Bellew Newbrow, first by placing the text within the larger framework of 19th century debates about race and human origins, and secondly by comparing it briefly to other more influential emergent religious movements in the late 19th and early 20th century that have also made race and human origins and the Redeemer nation of America of central concern. Telling the story of Newbrow in the text of OAHSPE can explicate the intersections that linked and still do political, social, religious, and scientific concerns for many Americans. The story about an obscure but stubbornly persisting faith community, these Facebook groups have, and there are 3 Facebook groups I found that focus on OAHSPE that are international. I'm assuming there's probably some overlap in the groups, but there's at least 600 people in these groups, overall. So a stubbornly persisting but small faith community. In some circles, the very definition of periphery can provide important clues about the actual nature of what is considered the center and the norm. So looking at these books, according to John Haller and Bruce Dane, who wrote The Hideous Monster of the Mind, one of the central disputes in 19th century biological science concerned what was often termed the species problem, quote unquote, namely the debate over whether all humans had descended from one or several distinct ancestors or creations. This was not an idle question, but, quote, highlighted one of the major confrontations between science and religion in the 19th century, unquote. We tend to think of the major confrontation as being between religion and Darwin, for example, and there were some confrontations there. But the real issue surrounding Darwin was that Darwin implied, at a time when polygenetic theories were all the rage in the United States, Darwin implied that all human species were in fact one species. That was the real issue, okay? For the first half of the 19th century, at least in American scientific schools, the monogenist view, as exemplified in the American naturalist Stanwell Smith, was dominant, either in its religious or rational variant. All humans either derived from an Adam and Eve pair, as Genesis had suggested, or were descended from the same basic stock, as the naturalist Linnaeus had indicated in his Systema Naturae. Differences between the quote-unquote races were caused primarily by environmental reasons, leading to local or regional variations as humans spread out. Closely allied to this theory was the notion of what Lamarck, who is another naturalist, who was what we call now a race theorist, he had advanced this notion of what he called racial senility. That types of humans could degenerate due to poor environmental conditions, and that these degenerate characteristics could be passed on to progeny. Positive, quote-unquote, acquired characteristics, unquote, could regenerate or improve other types of humans. In either case, miscegenation, or the mixing of types of people, was a mixed blessing, staving off racial senility in some humans, engendering it in others. Still, it did result in a wide variety of human types, and so the Linnaean system of classification was born. Linnaeus did not regard skin color as an absolute index of degeneracy, but he did seem to think that it was a relative indicator of possible senility. This is the race theory that informs and underlies the discussion of Israelites and Indians, or indigenous people, in the Book of Mormon, for example. While all humans, Jaredites, Nephites, and Lamanites alike in this book, derive from the same original creation, humans descended from Cain or degenerated by poor behavior bear the mark of darkened skin. And this is very plain in references like 2nd Nephi, I believe it's Nephi or Nephi, chapter 5, verse 21. While America is not mentioned by name, the fact that Christ appears to the North American Nephites, who are white in the text, and choose disciples among them, rather than, say, natives of Central Africa, South America, or Australia, is quite sufficient to establish America's sanctified status and the relative importance of having light skin. Rational monogenists, such as the naturalists Cuvier or Pritchard, insisted that while the earth was much older than traditional religion allowed, the Bible did contain the basic truth that all human types were related and of the same essential race. Now, this word, it is helpful to remember, also carried the connotation of species. 19th century biology texts also speak of races of elephants, races of birds, races of insects, which is odd to us when we read these things now. This view of the origin of humanity accorded well with Enlightenment ideals about the inherent abilities of all humans to progress towards an improved rational faculty. Monogenists were convinced that an internal order pervaded the natural world. So in its rational or biblical form, monogenism claimed a biological consanguinity that united different types of humans underneath the social appearances of class and skin color. To argue that the variations in human beings were more fundamental, and that even further not all humans originated from the same ancestor or creation, was to not only challenge the Genesis account, it struck at the heart of Enlightenment assumptions. However, beginning with Charles Caldwell in the 1820s, and he was an American, and influenced by the growing tide of white American unease and African American restlessness, following the slave revolutions in Haiti and the West Indies and the attempted revolt of African American Nat Turner, the advocates of polygenism began to gain ascendancy. Buttressed by a battery of somatometric data, these are body measurements, bristling with observations and anecdote, citing the experiences of slave owners and Indian fighter alike, American naturalists and ethnologists, as they called themselves, Louis Agassiz, Samuel Morton, and Josiah Knott, these are the names of the most prominent ones, sought to demonstrate definitively that variations in the human species were immutable and permanent. Differences in human forms or species could be accounted for by distinct episodes of creation. Pairs of Adams and Eves. Adam and Eve happened more than once, or perhaps a variety of different apish antecedents. Both monogenists and polygenists shared the previously described belief in racial senility, namely the idea that certain acquired characteristics can lead to the degeneration of a race, and that strong and vital races can be inclined toward degeneration by breeding with previously degenerated types. By 1850, polygenesis was the dominant, popular, and scientific account of race and human origins in American ethnology. Bruce Stein argues that this race theory was supported by the feelings of profound difference and unease that many Americans experienced as the tensions over slavery increased, as more Indians were encountered in the expanding frontier and the citizenships of the New Mexican and Chinese Americans were considered. And this is post-1848, after the Mexican-American War, which is its own thing, okay, and actually important to OAHSPE. Interestingly, conservative Southern slave owners were never comfortable with the challenge that polygenesis mounted against the story of Genesis, despite the fact that it was certainly a view of human origins that accorded well with their stated perceptions of the African Americans around them. Most retained a more religious view of the social stations of race and settled on monogenetic arguments that sought to locate both common human origins and a justification for the institution of slavery in the story of Noah and his sons, such as you can find in Genesis 9, verses 20 through 28. In fact, those verses are still used by white supremacists today. The polygenetic argument, while convenient for slave owners, was simply too scientific. Now, according to John Haller, the events of the Civil War and the popularization of Darwin dealt a death blow to the school of polygenetic theory in American ethnology. As he puts it, for most religious Americans thereafter, the revival of the confrontation between religion and science revolved now principally around the effort to give a teleology or a purpose to Darwin's natural selection, unquote. And so the familiar religious trajectories emerged. Liberal Christianity. In liberal Christianity, biblical and scientific accounts are separated, with the biblical account generally understood to be representative of mythology, or at the very most a meaningful allegory, science informing religion position. And the creationists, those who use both theories of evolution and the Genesis story to construct various versions of the instrumental design hypothesis, religion informing science position. And lastly, amongst some Christians, a complete rejection of Darwin and a reaffirmation of the simple biblical story as literal truth, the position of most but not all Christian fundamentalists today. Now, John Haller, citing Thomas Huxley, seems to assume that polygenism died a natural Darwinian hastened extinction. But the remainder of this presentation will illustrate that the story of polygenesis not only survived, it found a specific home in a number of emergent religious movements. And while I'll mention several, we will concentrate on the faithists. Those are the people who regard OAHSPE as a religious text. As an outlaw scientific theory, polygenesis had a special appeal. Combined with Lamarckian or eugenic speculations, polygenesis could retain a language and an atmosphere of science, and yet still reject Darwinian natural selection. Removing the specter of random variation allowed for the reintroduction of mechanisms implying meaning and order. And since sectarian Americans, namely various spiritualists, theosophists, and faithists, were not overly concerned with maintaining the absolute integrity of the biblical account, it became possible to develop other possible conceptions of meaningful order, control, or telos, informing the origin of humanity and the destiny of America, or at least in the case of Blavatsky, the destiny of the Aryan races. Indeed, speaking of Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, the mother of theosophy, was quite content in her cosmological work, The Secret Doctrine, 1888, to reject the biblical account altogether and to substitute her reading of a South Asian Puranic account of divine emanation, which informed, created, and evolved succeeding ages of root races whose traces could not only be read in culture, in the various forms and colors of humanity, but in the very geologic strata of the earth. According to classic theosophical doctrine, the fourth root race, the Aryan, has reached its apex and is beginning its slow descent into senility. The fifth root race is already being born in the land of America, she puts it, and in some places in Europe. Now, while it must be mentioned that the root race theory was not Blavatsky's main concern, in fact, she seems to regard it as an incidental excursus, that is, her way of linking Indian cosmologies of emanation with the burgeoning studies of stratigraphy in the field of geology. It's really subsequent people who made the root race thing more important than she actually made it. It is also true that the conception of root races found a ready home in the concerns of American theosophists. On the other side, radical American protagonists of the British Israelite Anglo-Saxonism, the immediate precursors to the sword and cross and Christian identity movements, these are the Christian neo-Nazi nationalists, white supremacist people, they developed Josiah Nott's proposition that the Genesis account was in fact simply detailing the histories of various white nations, and that the Bible has no application to any group of people outside of white Europeans. The redeeming destiny of America is not related to its ability to redeem anyone other than the white peoples who subdued the continent. In this case, not only are blacks and whites probably distinct species, they have separate gods, and one presumes separate and not necessarily equal heavens. However, one of the most interesting sectarian polygenetic accounts of the origin of humanity came out of the revelatory experiences of Dr. John Ballou Newbrow, a well-traveled practicing dentist who in the prime of his life undertook to fulfill a divine summons that would, according to the vision presented before him, explain and solve the social divides of race and class while reaffirming America's Redeemer destiny. Newbrow was born in Ohio in 1828 and by the age of 20 had traveled widely throughout the United States. He distinguished himself sufficiently in medical and dental studies that the surgeon under which he trained in Cleveland, Ohio, paid for the rest of his schooling. Newbrow quickly established a successful practice, but when 1848 brought news of new American territories, this is immediately post-Mexican-American War, brought news of new American territories and gold fields, the gold rush, his wanderlust returned, and he was one of the first Americans to head out in the fever that followed. Newbrow also nurtured a lifelong interest in spiritualism, and in his mind the first reports of spirit rappings by the Fox sisters, the news of the gold fields, and the expansion of America into the West following the war with Mexico, coming within months of each other in 1848, were indelibly linked as being of profound personal and spiritual importance. And in fact, in the book of OAHSPE, 1848 is year one in his new calendar, his new Cosmon calendar. His quest for gold and adventure led him first to California and then to Australia, and he detailed many of his observations in a fictionalized autobiography, The Lady of the West, which he self-published in 1855, and which I've read and can tell you that it's one of the worst written things I've ever had the misfortune to try to slog through, although there are many interesting bits in it. Like, if you try to read the whole thing, it's like, oh my God. But there are some interesting bits in it. In this text, Newbrow discusses the moral failings of self-professed high-standing Christians, this is how he calls them, in their interactions with indigenous peoples, Mexicans and Chinese immigrants in the recently acquired territories of New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The text evinces a deep distrust of organized religion in general, Christianity in particular. While he was in the Australian goldfields, Newbrow managed to broker and mine a modest fortune of $24,000, certainly enough by the standards of the day to travel comfortably around the world and return home with good investment potential. Now, in the wake of financial difficulties following the Civil War, Newbrow moved his practice to New York. There he married, had a couple of children, and became deeply involved in the spiritualist and Freemasonry communities in the city. Then in 1872, tragedy struck. One of his patients died in the chair. He was still a dentist as a result of nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide was something that was new at the time, and the problem with it was because it was new, and there was no FDA at the time, because it was new, they hadn't gotten dosages figured out, and he probably gave his patient too much. It was a young woman. She was probably a smaller person, and he probably gave her a little too much, and she probably died of either an allergic reaction to the compound or just he put her to sleep and she didn't wake up. The death was judged to be accidental, but it completely freaked him out. Although determined innocent, the event deeply impacted Newbrow. He became ever more involved in spiritualism. He began to purify himself through periodic fasting and finally reverted to a completely vegan diet, what we would call a vegan diet today, in order to lighten himself for the spirits. By the late 1870s, he had begun to receive regular visits from guiding spirits, as he was not content to merely commune with the dead, as spiritualists did. And in 1880, he was instructed by the spirits to purchase a typewriter, which was a new device at the time, because the period of revelation was at hand. This revelation, which is a 900 plus page text, so it depends on the edition that you get, but about that, is entitled OAHSPE, the Cosmon Revelations in the World of Jehovah and His Angel Ambassadors. And it was, according to his public account, received through the method of automatic writing on this typewriter. Every morning for about a year, Newbrow sat in trance before his typewriter, bathed in the spiritual light of a divine angelic presence. After several false starts, the heavenly presence ordered him to write without reading, and the book was published in 1882. Inspired by the cosmological theories of the astronomer William Herschel, who is credited with what's called the nebula theory of cosmological development, he was one of the first astronomers to suggest that there were galaxies and nebulas, and that the universe is incalculably large, especially at the time, and that there were other worlds and other places, that sort of thing. But he was impacted by astronomer William Herschel, but he was also impacted by the musings of the famous spiritualist Andrew Jackson Davis. One of the things that Andrew Jackson Davis was influenced by Herschel too, and one of the things that Davis does is he conflates the nebulas, as being not only a place where extraterrestrials may be coming from, but this is where the angels reside. This is where the dead resides. So for him, and there's some evidence that Davis was at least partially indigenous in his own personal origin, and so may have had access to certain kinds of indigenous ideas about this. But his idea was basically, as you go further into space, not only are you approaching nebulas, but you're also approaching different realms of the dead and different realms of reality in a way. It's very interesting. So inspired by these two people, OAHSPE basically tells the entire history of the Earth as it travels through our galaxy, encountering arcs or regions of space that impact the development of life on Earth. Although the cosmos is ultimately controlled by the Lord Jehovah, each region of space is provincially governed and inhabited by a different god or archon, some of whom cooperate with the Lord in his attempt to establish a peaceable kingdom on the earth, and some of whom send down underlings who present themselves as the supreme deity, and in the process create and harshly maintain most of the world's religions. Now, caught in the middle of this bureaucratic cosmic tug of war between the Lord and whichever god is in place are the various types of humans, the first having been formed simply of earth and were originally without souls, and they are called Asu. Subsequent human types are designated first by color. For example, the Ahin are white or yellow, and they are less violent and more intellectual and the keepers of occult mysteries. And the Ihuan, the brown or copper-colored people, and they are more violent, and yet are dominant and in some ways more creative. And then there are hybrids between the Ihuan and Ihin, and the older Asu people that are referred to as Druk or Yaks or ground people. And this is an illustration of these, of the Yaks or the Druks and the Ihun and Ihin, as you can see them here. There's actually a website which pulls out all of the illustrations in OAHSPE, of which there are many. There are over 100 illustrations of various types. And Newbrow did all of these illustrations, and he included them in his text. But this is an example of, and these are polygenetic, this is a polygenetic theory of the origin of human species. God just, or the Lord just created these different humans at different times. So most of the history of humans on Earth consists of varying experiments that Jehovah conducts with these different species in order to separate out the Ehin and Ehuan from the Druk. As the various races insist on violating prescriptions against miscegenation, the Lord begins to classify these resulting hybrids of humanity by their relative levels of compassion or propensities towards violence. By the present age, that of Cosmon, which, as I said, began for Neubrow in 1848, humans were far too mixed up for it to matter anymore what one's genesis was, and Jehovah had finally declared that a percentage of all types of human beings would be saved, and in the process granted even the Druks a soul. Significantly, OAHSPE strictly and emphatically rejects both Darwinian natural selection, since there, in his view, there is a creator, and the project of eugenics, which was just beginning to become popular in the progressive press. After all, if Jehovah couldn't get people to breed right, what makes humans think they can govern themselves in such matters? At this point, says OAHSPE, the great challenge facing humanity is not where one's ancestors ultimately came from, but how the human vices of violence, religious fanaticism, and aggression could be overcome. Focusing on origin, religious difference, and race is now but another deception born of the lesser gods, or the Drudge lords, as he calls them. Now, this is interesting because a lot of the language that Neubrow uses in order to talk about the choice between good and evil, or the darkness and the light, and the Drudge lords, those powers, whether they be gods or humans, that attempt to deceive other humans into eugenics or denying that there is a God. Much of that language is taken from Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism became very popular in the late 19th century, as you can remember by Friedrich Nietzsche actually using the image of Zoroaster or Zarathustra as sort of in his Thus Spake Zarathustra, to actually talk about the death of God and the death of religion. Basically for Nietzsche, Zarathustra is admitting that he was wrong, essentially. But for Neubrow, what was important about Zoroaster is what Zoroastrianism emphasizes, which are the ethical ideas of liberty, spiritual liberty, and equality of all human beings, and that all humans come from one place, but most importantly, that human beings have this faculty of will, which enables us to choose whether to do good or evil. And so OAHSPE is just full of this. Jehovah has given us the ability to choose, and we need to choose to do the right things. And since everybody's been given a soul now, we need to get over it. That's kind of what he's saying. Which, I don't disagree with that, actually. But because of this, many of his followers and people who continue to think of themselves as faithists even today will refer to him as the new Zoroaster, refer to Neubrow as the new Zoroaster, which I've always thought is really interesting. So for Neubrow, considered that America could be the perfect ground for this new vision, as its principles of liberty and hope for harmony between all peoples might indicate. Indeed, OAHSPE describes Jehovah as creating the conditions for America's founding with just this in mind. And this is from the book of chapter 20, verses 37-39. But in this era I come not to an exclusive people, but to the combination of all peoples commingled together as one people. Hence I have called this the Cosmon era. Henceforth my chosen shall be of the amalgamated races who choose me, and these shall be the best, most perfect of all peoples on earth, and they shall not consider race or color, but health and nobleness as to the mortal part, and as to spirit, peace, love, wisdom, and good works, and one great spirit only, unquote. So in 1882, Neubrow announced the revelation of OAHSPE in prominent spiritualist newspapers, and curiously, in the very same popular scientific journals, such as the Machinists and Electronics Journal, that often sought to debunk spiritualist claims. And I regard this as a move away from the spiritualist community from whom he was beginning to become estranged. A small group of the interested began to meet at his house, where they were introduced to the rest of the message, and they called themselves faithists, those who saw in OAHSPE the hand of truth. They were to gather to themselves orphans of every race and found a new community that would raise these children in harmony, separating them from the conflicts of humanity and the controlling religions of false gods, teaching them only of the one ultimate Lord and his vision of a unified humanity. In such a way, they could grow up understanding that each of them not only had a soul, but that they, now all admixtures of the first races, could help form an example of harmony. In the process, Newbrow hoped that his communal experiment could provide a way of easing the increasing burden of the burgeoning numbers of orphan children that were beginning to fill urban centers, a social condition born of poverty and epidemic that concerned eugenicists and social gospel revivalists alike. This was a big, huge deal in the 19th century. There were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of orphans. Seriously. The Shakers tried to deal with it, and he's still trying to deal with it in the 1890s. So investors were rallied, orphans were adopted, and land in Las Cruces, New Mexico was purchased. By 1888, ground had been broken, and Shalom Colony had been founded. At first, Shalom prospered. Newbrow and his assistant Andrew Howland hired local workers, mostly Mexicans, to help them build the community structures and work the desert land, providing much-needed employment in this relatively impoverished region. But such a venture is expensive, and most of the adults who had accompanied Newbrow to New Mexico were unfamiliar living off the land. Unlike Newbrow, most had not traveled widely, and some had obviously come expecting Newbrow to be more of a kook than he actually was. Apparently some expected an Oneida or Mormon-type style communal or plural marriage situation. What you have to do is recall that 1890 and 1891 was the year of the Great Accommodation, which was the large Mormon turn away from polygamy in order that Utah and the Mormons could be accepted more fully into the United States. And then there were the children. They had to be cared for, and some of the adults resented doing it. In 1891, an influenza epidemic hit the colony, and Newbrow was one of the fatalities. His partner, Andrew Howland, continued at Shalom for another 9 years, enduring economic hardships, a number of legal battles with former members, and his own declining health. Andrew Howland ended up marrying Newbrow's widow, not so much because they were in love or they had anything going on with each other, but apparently largely because there were rumors about that were not true. And so he married her in order to, and also to help her with lawsuits that were being, that they had to deal with. There were people that were trying to take the land away from her, that were trying to keep her from inheriting his assets. So he adopted Newbrow's remaining daughters, and he married Newbrow's widow. But trying to care for so many other children finally proved too much. In 1901, Shalom was officially closed, and the remaining orphan children were divided up by race, as was the social practice at the time, and sent to separate foster homes. The African-American children ended up in the Tuskegee Institute, that infamous place, and there they disappear from public record. According to adoption records, and these have been archived at the Library of Congress, I was able to view them, half of the remaining children, having been transferred to a Baptist facility in Texas, died within 18 months of leaving Shalom Colony. Shalom, is now known to be the last great American sectarian and communitarian effort of the 19th century, but it was abandoned and left to the elements by 1910. However, like the theory of polygenesis itself, the revelation of OAHSPE has refused to die what some might consider a natural death. With the closing of Shalom, A younger faithist, a man named A. Wing Anderson, undertook as his life work the project of continuing to publish OAHSPE, and he did publish a subsequent version of it, which was printed in a different format than the green version, and which you can find. In fact, when I was at the Library of Congress, I found that there were 4 editions, including an edition that was only on microfiche. Now, because it was, or on microfilm, because it was on microfilm, that implied that somewhere in the archives, the actual book had to have existed, but they could not find it. They did like a multi-month search for the original that the microfilm was based on, and they could not find it. What was interesting is that the microfilm appears to have been of a copy of one of the of probably the original edition, the very first original edition. And I say that because once I read through it, there were places in the margins that had been preserved where someone had gone in and corrected typos from the original version, which was fascinating to me. But they were never able to find the original book that the microfilm was based on. So A. Wing Anderson undertook as his life work the project of continuing to publish OAHSPE and keep the vision of John Newbrow alive. In an attempt to make OAHSPE more accessible, Anderson continued a project first begun but not completed by Andrew Howland, and published a series of booklets that brought together sections of OAHSPE by topic, including one that specifically addressed the polygenetic origins of humanity. And I was able to locate that. There is a copy of that in particular at the Library of Congress that provided some of the very specific background that I was able to give you about all of this. Anderson's efforts encouraged others, excuse me, sorry about that. Let's see here. Anderson's efforts encouraged others interested in OAHSPE to attempt the founding of less ambitious faithist colonies in Colorado, California, and Utah, although none of these were successful. Followers such as the British author Augustine Cahill published secondary interpretations of faithist doctrines based on OAHSPE, Darkness, Dawn, and Destiny, which I did find a copy of at the Library of Congress. It was published in 1965. And he also refers to Newbrow as the second Zarathustra. Other maverick publishers, as I mentioned, such as pulp fiction writer Ray Palmer and the more recent faithist Elohist David Calroni, have labored to keep OAHSPE in print. And in fact, Calroni is still alive and around. He is one of the administrators of one of these OAHSPE Facebook groups, and is a frequent poster. Recently, interest in OAHSPE and Shalem Colony have been revived due in part to the efforts of these determined faithists, but also because local historians in New Mexico and several religious studies scholars, and keep in mind this is back in 2004, 2005, many of them amateurs, and in fact one of the people that I did quite a bit of correspondence with at the time when I was writing this was a guy named Jim Denon, who had played a very important role in contacting the state of New Mexico and getting the buildings and the lands of Shalem Colony, which are now on private property, getting them grandfathered into national heritage sites, or at least state heritage sites, so that the farmers on where these ruins exist, the farmers will not just routinely destroy them. But New Mexico came to see the value in preserving information about a unique religious and social experiment. I think there's actually a museum now that exists. Archives have been established at Las Cruces and in Albuquerque to preserve all possible references to OAHSPE and the Shalem Colony. In May 2004, the state of New Mexico allocated funds for the establishment of an OAHSPE museum in Las Cruces, which I believe is still there. The first OAHSPE conference was held in July of that year. I was actually invited to come, but there was no way I could make it there. But I did write a paper that they read for that first conference. I don't think the conference occurs anymore, But I do know that there are regular Zoom meetings, international Zoom meetings, actually, that occur between these various faithists in various parts of the country. The revelation of OAHSPE has become a topic of interest, meriting comment by New Age channels and by the promoters of other sectarian texts such as the Urantia book. In fact, if I remember right, the Urantia book does mention OAHSPE, either by name or by the use of certain vocabulary. At the time when I was writing this, Yahoo hosted 3 OAHSPE faithist chat discussion groups. I think those have probably gone away, but Facebook makes up for that now. Many members seem to hail from Australia, who are delighted that the prophet of this revelation had such good things to say about his sojourn there. There's an audio recording of this text that is in the works, although I don't know if it's not available on Audible that I was able to find. But it might be available through one of these groups. When I was examining these groups and interviewing people, the most recent topics of interest in those groups have involved deciding whether the Hopi Indians are examples of the Ahin or Ahuan people, whether the war in Iraq, because you remember we were in Iraq at the time, is but another example of drudge lord deception. They all seem to believe that it was. And it seems that some Americans and Australians are still struggling with stories of origin and destiny. I would say that the jury's still out on that. Today, overt polygenetic theories in American religious life are found most frequently in New Age and UFO contact communities and are derived almost exclusively from theosophical models. In most of these narratives, the varieties of and differences between humans are derived from cycles of cosmic emanation, a process which in itself is considered automatic, leaving the effects of influence to ascended masters who help to shape and mold the resulting humankinds. While not exclusively concerned with skin color as an index for the relative senility or youthful vitality of a race, it is important to note that in most theosophical systems, the only senile races, groups, or types of humans listed in most interpretations of the root race theory are those who are considered quote-unquote primitive, stubborn, and backward, those most desiring of distinct culture, identity, and self-determination, and who just also happen to be usually people with darker skin or who have suffered under European colonialism. So in extraterrestrial versions of this scenario, current polygenetic scenario, different human types were seeded or generated by various groups of alien visitors who now compete with each other for control of the hybrids they've created. Followers of the Urantian revelation and proponents of ascensionism, a rapidly growing synthesis of theosophy, new thought, and spiritualism, and inspired by the Book of Knowledge, Keys of Enoch, often invoke polygenesis as an illustration of the need for starseed humans, quote-unquote, to activate dormant strands of etheric DNA that they may ascend above others not so evolved. People are still using some of this language 20 years later. David Icke, a very popular internationally known theosophist and conspiracy theorist, advocates a complex synthesis of this narrative in which violent, dark aliens, the reptilians, and their interbred human minions have almost total control of all political and economic systems on Earth, and it is left to starborn humans and their alien allies with bodies of light to liberate themselves in the world from a sinister plot that is intended to ensnare human DNA in endless cycles of forced reproduction and species mixing. Indeed, the overall plot of an ancient pre-human physical race followed by 2 main competing races with the related questions of miscegenation, I never can pronounce this, race mixing, okay, that's what it means, is a theme that one finds repeated in articulations of root race theories and in the Book of Mormon, among the Jaredites, Nephites, and Lamanites, obviously in OAHSPE, and the Book of Knowledge, the pre-Agelites, the Pleiadian Orion-based Egyptian Israelite tetrahedron, Children of Light, and the Ursa Major, Alpha Draconis Muslim Cubic Fallen Masters of Darkness, which when we do J.J. her talk, you'll understand what all that crap means. Now, while OAHSPE cannot be considered influential as such, it can be considered representative, not only of the persistence of polygenetic theory, but also as a kind of compendium, describing the various trajectories and influences which would inform later American sectarian religious production. OAHSPE was the first large-scale sectarian American religious work to make the claim that the gods are extraterrestrials. Even the hosts of the Lord travel to Earth in fire ships. He calls them Etherians, and etheric fire ships, and that the battles with America as a penultimate focus between the forces of good and light are of galactic importance. Such features are extraordinarily common in most American sectarian revelatory texts, and in science fiction, I might add. And in fact, I would argue that one of the places in which OAHSPE has been somewhat influential is in science fiction, especially once Ray Palmer got a hold of it and used some of those ideas in some of his productions. I have seen various elements of OAHSPE present in comic books, animation, anime, that sort of thing. Obviously, similar cosmologies can be found in that developed by L. Ron Hubbard for his religion of Scientology, and the convoluted cosmic hierarchies that are featured in the Urantia book and the Book of Knowledge, even though there is no direct evidence of borrowing or transmission other than the use of similar language. Finally, and this is an interesting thing, OAHSPE has made what now seems to be prescient observations. And there are at least a couple of these. And let me find an illustration to show you. One of the most fascinating things that I found when I was looking at or reading through OAHSPE, and there are a number of illustrations of these. As I mentioned, the way that the history of the Earth is understood is it's not just the history of the Earth, it's the history of the Earth as it's traveling through different regions in space, namely basically our galaxy. And we know now that the Earth does travel around our galaxy. I don't know that it's a periodicity of like, I don't know, every 35,000 years or something. I don't even remember exactly. But that's how time is measured. And as it goes through these different regions of space or these different regions of the galaxy, it encounters different kinds of things and different just types of energy or types of dust, or just different regions have different things that the entire solar system encounters, and especially the Earth as it goes through. And these different regions, each region is ruled by a different sort of deity or being, and each region affects the development of life on Earth in different ways. And this illustration here is an illustration of the Earth as it is traveling through the arc or the region of Bon. And this was in the cycle of Moses, and Jehovah made the sign of the triumph of light to endure 400 years. So basically what the idea is you get this image of this little Earth, and what's fascinating to me is that he imaged the Earth as if he was out away from the Earth, like if he was far away from the Earth, kind of like those photographs, those early photographs we have of Earth, like from the moon, where you see the Earth like far away, he imagines being outside of the Earth and watching the Earth go through these regions of space, and then writes a revelation about the history of the Earth and what that meant, what going through that part of space did, and what the being or godlet who ruled that region of space, how they affected the Earth. What's interesting about this idea is that there is now a theory, an astrophysical theory, that there might be, that we do know that the Earth does go through around the galaxy and does go through regions of the galaxy, some regions of which have more dust in them, or just other things, and that it's quite possible that, as some scientists have noticed, that that linked to our periodicity of going around the galaxy, that there are certain geological things, records that seem to correspond with things that we might be coming in contact with physically as we go through the galaxy. I mean, it's not like something that is completely beyond the realm of possibility to think about that. Now, granted, the solar system as a whole is traveling together, and there is a kind of, because the solar system is a system, there is a kind of envelope. It's called the heliosphere, I believe is what it's called. A kind of magnetic and caused by gravity, by the unit that is the solar system. All of us sort of travel together as a unit, but that doesn't mean that other things that it encounters might not be affected by it. So it's fascinating that he had this ability to see the Earth from outside of the Earth and think about what it would mean for the Earth to be traveling through our galaxy. I mean, that's kind of interesting. Another thing that he, so as I put it here, OAHSPE made what now seem to be prescient observations about the Earth visualized as an actual object in space, influencing and being influenced by cosmic or galactic forces, as if Newbrow somehow glimpsed the reality of the Earth as a living body traveling through a cosmos that cannot be entirely predicted or controlled, and yet retains a sense of order and purpose. A seeing of the Earth from afar that is more like the satellite photos that we are familiar with today than the views of Earth promoted by Newbrow's contemporaries. OAHSPE also envisions planets in space as creating vortices around themselves, and in fact, he has a number of different illustrations that are attempts to look at these vortices, at distorting what we would now call gravity. We call this phenomenon a gravity well today. Let's see if I can find one here. Okay, so this is the vortex that he imagined being around the sun. In other words, that the sun itself would have this vortex of energy that would control the orbits of planets around it, and that it would subject things coming within its purview. It would basically distort space, essentially. So he's talking about what we would call a gravity well today, which is fascinating. I mean, he uses a different language for it, but that's basically what he's trying to illustrate here. He also talks about how the in any of you who recognize this, this is a Fulcanelli, a Fulcanelli curve, or whatever it's called. He also argued that the movement of planets and the movement of the planets in the solar system, and then the solar system itself as it moved through space, was not circular but serpentine, which we now know to be true. As all of the planets go around the sun, the entire solar system kind of wobbles. And you can actually get online and you can see, mathematically projected videos of this, created videos of this. It's not something that we can see, but it's something that explains, it's the only way in which all the planets could sort of move together, because the planets are not all on one plane. They are at different angles to each other relative to the sun, even though they're all strung out. So it's fascinating. And it's like, how did he come up with these things? I mean, he saw this stuff, apparently. So he had some kind of ability. I guess we would call it remote viewing. Probably the last and most interesting thing is that he proposed a theory. It was kind of like his version of his version of Atlantis, but he proposed that at one time there was one large landmass altogether, like one large landmass altogether before the flood. And he referred to this large landmass as Pan, and that this large landmass was broken up, and the landmasses that we now know developed partly because of the Great Flood, but also because of the movement of land itself. The theory that he proposes is startlingly similar to plate tectonics. It's bizarre. I mean, he doesn't have that language, you know, but what he's describing is something very similar. During a period when geologic gradualism and uniformitism held sway, OAHSPE insisted that while the Earth was ancient, its surface was also marked by the catastrophic sinking and breaking up of continents in much the same way that we now know occurs and has occurred. But most significantly, and for us with retrospective irony, OAHSPE reserves its harshest criticism for the incipient violence of religious fanaticism, and predicts, and this is predicting in the 1880s, predicts if religion doesn't die or transform itself by 1947, keep that date in mind, 1947, what was going on in 1947? Think about it. Immediate post-World War, Israel being founded, Cold War starting, it goes on and on, right? UFO stuff starting, that kind of thing. Okay, so if religion doesn't die or transform itself by 1947, the resulting political poisons will engulf the planet. All religions are included in this analysis. In the end, America will succeed in its redemptive mission only if it adheres to the principles of complete, total liberty and compassion for all the now amalgamated races, because we are all now amalgamated races, and ceases to categorize people by color and religious affiliation. I'm sure that Newbrow could not have imagined the turmoils over identity and community that were to come in America and beyond.